Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics. This week we ask what explains successes and setbacks in the promotion of LGBT plus rights, and is political science as welcoming as it should be towards LGBT plus research? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. The transformation of LGBT plus lives in many societies has been one of the greatest advances of the last half century. Where previously there was criminalization and ostracism, today often there is inclusion and celebration. But this has not happened equally everywhere or for all LGBT plus people. And in some places, on some issues, there are strong counter-movements. So what explains the successes and the setbacks in advancing LGBT plus rights? And what can other advocacy networks learn from the LGBT plus movement? Well, the research of one of our newest colleagues here in the UCL Department of Political Science focuses on exactly these questions. He is Philip Ayoub, Professor of International Relations, and I'm delighted to say that he joins me here today. Philip has also recently written a piece about the place of LGBT plus people and research within political science, and we'll explore that a little later too. So, Philip, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, and I'd like to start with what I guess is the central focus of your research on what shapes success and failure in promoting LGBT plus rights. Your book, When States Come Out, Europe's Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility, was published a few years ago, but you're new to UCL, of course, and I guess some listeners may not be familiar with it. So do you want to tell us what you were asking in that book and what you found?
Thank you, Ellen. Thanks a lot for having me here. And yes, I'm very happy to do that. My book asks the question of why some states adopt LGBTI rights and not other states. And I really focused on the importance of transnational movements and norms, which I argue have reshaped the lived experience for LGBTI people in many contexts, certainly not all, as you already alluded to, but in many places. And there was a puzzle inherent in that question because much of the early work had isolated such change to domestic factors like secularism, wealth, or high levels of democracy. But in many of the states around the globe that started adopting these rights, and started adopting them very quickly, they challenged some of those theories in that we had a lot of surprising kinds of states that adopt them. So you can think of, for example, Ireland passing marriage equality by popular vote in 2015. That's certainly not really what we expected of that particular case. Indeed, this whole transformation around issues like marriage equality have been very surprising, given that, not long ago, just a little over 20 years ago, the Netherlands was the first country to adopt full marriage equality, following, Denmark, which adopted registered partnership for the first time just over 30 years ago in 1989. But today, many dozens of states have policies like that. Actually, over 20 European states have adopted some form of same-sex union at the federal level, and we have countries on all continents, that are having some forms of same-sex unions in certain states. And so that's been really interesting to try to understand. And I think that led me to argue that alongside those earlier domestic explanations, we have to also look at, something transnational or transnational currents that seem to be having some kind of an effect on this issue, because it's certainly not a coincidence that we see these kind of issues popping up in multiple places. And that argument, that I developed, tried to say that there's a process where various channels of norm visibility have increased the felt expediency of states to adopt these kind of rights, in that they also use these rights to signal to their international communities that they are legitimate members of them. And there's certain kind of channels that make states more attuned to these issues. And so there, for example, you have social channels of visibility, which include the circulation of ideas and images, which, for example, some folks talked about the Will and Grace effect back in the 90s, which my students have told me is not the best example of media featuring LGBT people, but it certainly introduces new characters and new types of people across borders. There are also political channels, which is another channel of visibility, which I argue are very important in that they have intensified ties between states and international organizations that have started to request states to introduce some of these rights. And here the European Union is a key example of an international organization that has some standards that states have to meet now to join the European Union that also encompass LGBT people, for example, workplace anti-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And then, importantly, there's a mediated channel that I argue in the book is quite important, and that emerges through the work of transnational advocacy networks. And these mediated channels are key because they involve local activists who are also embedded in transnational networks, and they mediate between international and domestic norms to frame the message so that it would fit locally and that it can quell perceptions of threat that are so often assigned to LGBT rights norms. And that means the same kind of norms around LGBT rights might be packaged very differently in different audiences. And so you could have an LGBT pride parade in Poland can be described in using frames of Catholic, of the Catholic religion, like love thy neighbor, which obviously would make less sense in the UK. But these are the work. These activists are playing two-level games in that they are working in transnational advocacy networks where they can extract certain resources and certain best practices, but then they can also reshape and repackage those ways of doing things in their own specific context in a way that can try to quell the contentious nature of the issue for a specific audience.
That's a fantastic overview. Thank you so much. And before we get further into your own particular account of what's going on here, shall we say a little bit more about the kind of theories and ideas about movement success that you were responding to? So you talked about how some of the cases, Ireland adopting same-sex marriage, for example, might have been regarded as quite surprising from the perspective of some of the existing theories about movement success. Do you want to say a bit more about what were the kinds of factors that were presumed to be important in those existing theories?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the earlier work had focused on the kind of small states that we think of as most likely to do, interesting things around gender and sexuality. And so often the Netherlands or Sweden, these were the kind of states that had long histories of women's movements, were relatively rich, were highly democratic, and were quite secular states as well. And so they seemed like the usual, or the prime suspects for adopting and being pioneers on these kinds of issues. And indeed, those factors did explain, in many cases, where our contemporary articulations of LGBT rights emerged. But when we look at where they spread, then it becomes often a different set of factors. And so if you look at newer adopter states that followed those norms, you see a lot of other factors playing a role. And in many cases, some of those states would leapfrog earlier success states. So you could think of a country like Spain that was kind of written off as too Catholic for LGBT rights for a while, adopting marriage equality quite early and being quite a leader in that area where attitudes changed quite quickly, where other pieces of legislation affecting LGBTI people were innovated and developed, and in some cases even surpassing some of the model first mover states. And so that is in part what I was responding to with the earlier literature on LGBT rights. I also of course drew heavily from work that was focusing on transnational advocacy to make those claims. And there you have important work by Kekin Sikink and others that has really has reshaped how we think about world politics. But there too, I really think the LGBTI case is a very interesting one because it teaches us and nuances some of what we know in that transnational advocacy space as well, given that there have been few cases of change in the world in the last 3 decades that have had such tremendous change when it comes to shifts in attitudes and also proliferation of new kinds of legal institutions that have spread across cases. And we'll talk a lot later about how a lot of these rights only apply to some groups and in some states, and there's a lot of fraught contestation around them. But there has been unexpected and remarkable degrees of change in some aspects of these rights. And I think that's something that we also didn't didn't fully capture or expect in world politics theory, and studying it has taught us a few things about what we knew there as well. And for example, the World Society School in Sociology, which much early work on transnational advocacy rested on, really underestimated, I think, agency and the importance of having actors on the ground that can graft and frame contested rights to very different local contexts. And this is one of the takeaways, about localization and what I call norm brokerage, which is to really emphasize needing actors on the ground that can package rights in a certain way, and it challenges the idea that this rights diffusion can be orchestrated successfully from the top down. And so when you have INGOs or IOs trying to push for LGBT rights on their own, oftentimes that doesn't work if you don't have, allies who are requesting that kind of support locally. Another main takeaway is with LGBTI rights is that there's backlash everywhere. And so unlike some of the norms that we used to study, which were less contentious, LGBT rights are just always highly contested. And it's a very hard case for change because we have underestimated, I think, the resistance that comes with some norms. And that's resistance that appears at all levels, whether local or at the state level or at the international level, which is part and parcel of the way that LGBTI norm diffusion works. And I think those are, just to not go on too long, a couple of the main takeaways that we can use to theorizing other trends in politics or in political science.
And is it fair to say that the core concept in your approach to understanding success here is the concept of visibility? I mean, you've got it. You talked about it earlier, and it's in the title of your book. And what do you mean by visibility exactly? And just what are the mechanisms through which visibility is really working here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, visibility is a very tricky concept, and I talk about it as kind of a double-edged sword in the book because it has some key it has some important effects in terms of making a group visible in a way that it can demand rights. But of course, it also comes with serious consequences. Visibility can also lead to heightened attention to a group that can increase violence toward them. And thus, it's so important, as I mentioned before, that it is local activists that are steering when that visibility needs to take place and whether the context is ready for that visibility or not. What I mean in the book by norm visibility is, I emphasize that for a norm to have effects and to be felt, it needs to be visible in the domestic space. And that's something quite interesting that LGBT rights can teach us, because we often assume in the literature that norms just kind of float around everywhere. But I think that their felt intensity matters a lot, and that felt intensity is contingent upon the kind of channels that make certain norms visible in certain contexts and not in others. So, what makes a state more porous to those norms has a lot to do with the kind of social, political, and mediated channels of visibility that I described before. And there you see a lot of variation across states, and that's something we can also test quantitatively to see that in new adopter states, those kind of channels, they vary across states, and they have outputs when it comes to adopting LGBTI rights. That doesn't mean that these are the only circulating norms, and that's, I think, something we'll probably get to later. There's also competing norms that become visible and bad ideas that become visible that also work according to that same logic, and that can also diffuse other kinds of policies, depending on how norms enter different domestic spaces.
And how exactly is visibility having an effect? I mean, is it directly upon general public opinion? Is it opinion among certain kind of elites that they shift and then they bring public with them? And what are the dynamics that are operating here?
I think the dynamics are complicated, and I look at both norm compliance and norm internalization across different states. So the compliance deals with the degree to which states adopt laws, and that's often, one of the first ways that visibility works is that states feel an imperative to adopt a certain norm and to codify it in law in order to signal to their broader community of states that they have recognized that norm and are doing something about it. And there you can see, for example, if you think of like Malta, which sits now on top of many indices of LGBTI rights, the leadership there and the parliament there has often talked about it as a way to signal their place as a modern state in the European Union. And of course, that is quite sinister and also problematic, that's what's driving part of this transformation, and not actually wanting to protect local LGBT communities. And I mean, often they go hand in hand, but a lot of the rhetoric has focused on the former, but it shows the way that, this kind of visibility can shift political elites. And in many cases, that can also transform attitudes. I mean, we have, I looked at this in the book, and there's a lot of research in Latin America and North America that say that, the movement by elites on these issues do lead then later on to more positive attitudes in the general population. I think there's still work to be done in terms of how that can vary across contexts. And in Eastern Europe, for example, we've oftentimes seen attitudes, the visibility lead first to more negative attitudes, in part because that enters puts a spotlight on LGBT people and creates a debate around them that often includes a lot of disparaging and negative voices. And then you can see shifts in attitudes going in both directions. But if there is a movement on the ground that can really reclaim that space in the discourse, and oftentimes you see attitudes that dip then bounce back in a way that research has shown in North America or Latin America or Western Europe to take place.
So it's really interesting there that you're getting contradictory responses to visibility in different places. So in some places you're suggesting that visibility leads to a transformation in public attitudes towards greater support for LGBT plus rights. Whereas in other places, you're saying, at least in the short term, a backlash being the dominant response. And what's producing that? Is it something about the strategies of the LGBT plus movements in these places? Is it something about underlying attitudes? Is it something about the nature of the reactions from movements pushing in the other direction? What can we tell what's shaping these different responses?
Well, I mean, certainly strategies can be misplaced in some cases, but I think the overarching explanation of this quite uniform gut reaction of resistance in so many contexts has a lot to do with the way that gender and sexuality are seen as a threat to more fixed identities like nationalism or religion. And that's in part because gender and sexuality are very fluid concepts, and they are perceived in many societies, and that's also exploited by political actors as destabilizing to their imagined identities of what their society is supposed to look like. And that's why oftentimes LGBT rights, even though we have plenty of research that shows that adopting LGBT rights does not hurt the economy or make states less secure or have any of these negative effects that are often theorized, they are perceived as, quote unquote, threatening to national identity in ways that provokes kind of a resistance. And that's something that, of course, visibility is very important for these groups because it brings them into being. It makes, it provides new ways of understanding oneself to many queer people who can draw on that visibility to push for new rights or to be politicized themselves. But of course, that visibility is also, fraught in that it introduces a lot of debate and a lot of counter movements that will respond to it with very different arguments. And that means that it is, we're studying here contentious politics and social movements, and it's never kind of a uniform or clear path. And I mean, LGBT rights makes that very clear.
Okay, so we've been talking there about the concept of visibility, and I guess the other thing that I was struck by when you were introducing the thesis of your book at the start there was that you emphasized the role of transnational factors rather than just domestic factors. What is the international relations aspect of all of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, the international relations, actually research in international relations generally has really not paid much attention to LGBTI rights, and given that it's seen as a weak group in world politics. But what is really fascinating is that this so-called weak group has has had tremendous effects on world politics in terms of the norms that it has spread to many states. And it also features, beyond my work in a central way in a lot of geopolitics that IR scholars are quite interested in when it comes to war and security. And I mean, just to give one example that we see everywhere when it comes to the current war in Ukraine, that the way that Vladimir Putin has, since 2004, been talking about the need to protect Ukraine, or quote unquote protect Ukraine from so-called Gayropa, which is this word for the European Union or Western Europe, and that to keep it in its sphere of influence that would protect so-called traditional values. This has been central to that conflict, and it keeps emerging again in kind of justifications for the latest intensification of that war earlier this year. And LGBT scholars have been really writing about that issue for over a decade, and it's something that has, even in these, the most mainstream foci of international relations scholars, played such a central role in kind of constructing that conflict, and many others like it, where LGBT rights are seen as a type of foreign imposition that states need to defend in a way that's really interesting for research. And of course, political elites are doing that, I think, strategically and exploiting this issue for their own political gain, but it is featuring centrally in those kind of conversations.
And I guess that takes us on to your recent paper called Not That Niche, where you looked at the role of LGBT research within political science as a whole. And you argued that LGBT research and researchers don't have the status that they should have, essentially, in political science. Do you want to just develop a little bit further your argument for saying that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that paper grows out of a lot of conversations with colleagues who've been really kind of charting forward this new area on LGBT politics within political science. And it's a relatively new area. Many of our main conferences only had sections dealing with these issues in the last 10 or 15 years. And outside of rare exceptions, we still see that, hiring committees at most institutions really fail to single out LGBTI work. And it's very rare that you see a job description, if at all, ever looking specifically for such expertise. And professors working in these areas are also largely absent from many of the field's leading graduate programs, which also shapes training for new faculty that might be able to address these questions down the road. And there are many other examples like that this work is rarely on syllabi, which means that students also and allies that they don't see themselves in the field, or they receive signals early on that political science isn't a space for them. And of course, then also many of the field's top journals, which have only in the last year started really featuring work that deals with LGBTI politics. And I'll note that, when I was a grad student, the APSR, which had managed to go about 100 years without ever going to LGBT people's experience at all as politics, which is really puzzling to me, given how political this movement and the issues affecting people who identify that way are. I mean, if we think of the gains that movement made in the pre-war period, the pre-Second World War period, to having those movements extinguished by National Socialism, to having those movements reappear right alongside civil rights in the post-war period, to have, the HIV/AIDS crisis. So if we think about nationalism in politics, religion in politics, public health, I mean, I really think a lot about HIV/AIDS crisis, and political science really left that health crisis to a lot of other fields to study, even though it was really precisely the failure of political institutions that also exacerbated that health crisis for so long. But then when we had COVID, which was a health crisis that also affected, or that was seen, of course, HIV affects all sorts of populations, but it was seen early on and perceived as a gay issue. But with COVID, we have had, every political science journal racing to have a special issue on that health crisis. And I think we would have learned a lot had we thought about the politics of public health related to LGBT people in the decades before. So these are, some of the issues that I think we still see in the field, and we're starting to see a shift in political science in many countries, and a younger generation of scholars that is really energized and I think pushing for change in innovative ways. But it remains quite overdue. And there remain substantial liabilities to doing this work in many countries. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that, even the European Union, a country like Hungary has, basically shuttered gender studies work, which means that there's actually scholars who work on LGBT rights in the European Union who are in exile within the EU, working in other countries, which is really, really troubling and shows that we still have really a long way to go. And I think there needs to be much more attention. And I think that attention would also benefit many aspects of theorizing in our field.
But you're arguing this isn't just an issue in Hungary. It's not just an issue in the past. It's an issue that remains present today within our discipline in the United States, in the UK, in other European countries.
Absolutely. I fully agree with that. And the gains that we've seen are, I think, just small steps in the right direction, but it has a very long way to go before we see, top graduate training programs having faculty working on LGBT politics in them, which would then meet a demand that many of our students have. I mean, it's undeniable that a lot of students are rightly asking institutions to teach them about issues that they see have transformed their own lives or the lives of people around them, and they in real time, and they want a lot of answers to those questions.
Great. We should talk a bit about your current research. So we've been talking about the research that you've done in the past, but what are you working on at the moment?
Well, I'm always working on a few too many things, but one of the larger projects that I'm working on, which I would be happy to talk to you about, it actually started when I was a postdoc at the UI in 2013. So it was actually before this book that I mentioned before was out. But it was already a time where we saw the intensification of backlash, which of course always existed, but started appearing more at the international level. And you saw a lot of powerful states. Here again, namely Russia, came to mind in that period when I was developing this project, to start actively blocking some of the newfound successes the LGBT rights movement had made and doing so at the international level. And I met Christina Stöckel at the UI when I was a postdoc there, and she is a sociologist of religion. And we applied for a grant together that we won, and Christina is the PI on that grant, and I work on this LGBTI stream, which looks at global resistances to LGBTI rights. And we basically been working on the other side of the coin of my Cambridge book, which is to argue that there's a lot of pushback globally against gendered movements, including women's movements and LGBTI movements, and they work in a similar way. So they can also rely on transnational advocacy groups, for example, the World Congress of Families, and they can rely on the support of IOs like the Catholic and Orthodox Church, and the support of powerful states like the Russian state or other states like Hungary and Poland, that can really peddle a kind of narrative around so-called gender ideology that is presented as a threat to traditional values in countries all over the world. And this, this means that there's these coalitions that also span the global north and global south, and that really diffuse new kinds of policies around religious freedom or rights of the family or rights of the child that are presented as in contradiction to LGBTI rights. And of course, a lot of LGBT movements don't feel like the rights that they ask for should contradict those other kind of rights, but they have been constructed in a way that presents them that way. And that is having an effect in world politics. We see changes actually just this week. If you read the newspapers yesterday, you will have read that Russia has expanded its so-called anti-gay propaganda ban. That was a law in 2013 that had banned the exposure of minors to any LGBTI expression. But now that has been extended to all adults, which effectively entirely removes any kind of LGBT activism from the public sphere. And that kind of policy has taken hold in many different places. So we saw Hungary pass a law like that in 2021, which somewhat like its Russian counterpart before it also seeks to ban LGBT discourse from the public sphere, and also, like the Russian example, problematically links it to pedophilia. And so these kind of movements are having an effect in world politics and explains a lot of the polarization we see around these issues. And that's something that Christina and I have been trying to contribute to with our research, and we've been working on a book for all of these years since, where we've interviewed a lot of the key organizers in that anti-gender mobilization, and we call them politicized moral conservative actors. And we've tried to expand on IR theories around the boomerang and spiral models of human rights diffusion to argue that these models often theorize a process where contestation appears only in the domestic space, but we should really think that it works more like a double helix spiral, where there's contestation at all levels, at the local, at the domestic, and at the international level. And that means that different transnational advocacy networks have to respond to contestation in all venues, at the UN, at the European Court of Human Rights, and they also, in that response, are changing how they frame their issues, and it's a constant space of interaction, and that also has tangible effects on the states that they're working in, and this work is, dovetailing a lot of great work that we've seen come out in recent years by, for example, David Paternotte and Roman Kuar, who worked extensively on gender ideology with their colleagues in a very important book called Anti-Gender Mobilizations in Europe. Christopher Velasco, who's a former student of mine, now professor at Princeton, who's doing really incredible systematic work looking at the effects of these networks in different states, depending on which network, the anti-gender one or the LGBTI one, has more power. So it's in a way, an extension, an unfortunate extension, you could say, of some of the older research in the book that was really, that was actually also quite cautious about its optimism, but was also acknowledging that we'd seen some positive change, and now, working more on the reality that these tools that led to that change are available to all sorts of movements, even ones that might introduce a more challenging experience for LGBTI people.
I'm fascinated to know more about the double helix model. Unfortunately, we're running out of time now, so we'll have to invite you back on when that book is published. But just before we finish, I'd really like to just explore a little bit the kind of practical implications of this, I guess, particularly for movements or campaigning for these rights around the world. And the trans rights movement is particularly facing contestation at the moment and facing this kind of backlash that you're talking about. Are there any lessons from your work about how the trans rights movement can best promote its objectives in light of the kinds of reactions that it is seeing around the world?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about trans activism, which is very important and unfortunately very timely in the sense that it's also such a targeted aspect of LGBT rights mobilization. I think it's fair to say the most targeted aspect. Of course, a lot of what I talked about earlier when we talk about LGBTI rights, it is there's a lot of intersectional divisions between groups there, and a lot of the rights that had been won have affected white upper middle class gay men, for example, more than other minorities in other marginalized groups under that umbrella. And so here, when we think of trans activism, which has always stood alongside LGBT rights and solidarity, have often their issues have often been put to the side, including by LGBT movements. That said, there are many of the lessons of the book apply here centrally. We've seen the transnational organizing of trans activists, both in the LGBTI umbrella, but then also separately, because there's been rightly complaints amongst trans activism that oftentimes LGBTI organizations add the T and the I, but don't really deal with trans issues, and intersex activists might say the same about intersex issues. So trans activists have also developed transnational advocacy groups like Transgender Europe, which is a group based out of Berlin that does a lot of work tracking violence towards trans people across different countries, lobbying IOs, lobbying other LGBTI and international NGOs to address specific issues that affect trans people. And we've seen, in the last 10 years, some of that has worked quite well. We see a lot of gender recognition bills being introduced in many countries across the world, including, more progressive forms of them that rely on self-identification. And so there has been, some positive change due to this similar kind of activism. At the same time, as you rightly point out, trans groups have been among the most targeted by the opposition that I spoke about before. And while I don't really see, especially as a cis man myself, of giving advice to how trans activists should do their work or strategize, I'd really like to point out one thing that is, I think, applies to this whole conversation that I haven't mentioned yet, is that there is always an assumption that this contestation and the response to it is a response to something that the LGBTI or the trans movement did specifically that could have been done better, or a reaction to it. When indeed we have to keep in mind that a lot of research shows that a lot of political homo and transphobia is in fact preemptive, that a lot of political elites realize that these issues can be galvanized for their own political gain. And so a lot of times there's not even a clear request or an attempt to be visible by a trans movement in a country where the political elite will still, weaponize those issues and make it a major political issue. And that goes back a little bit before to your question about visibility and how it can have different effects depending on who is in control of that visibility. So I think in trans activism, there's been a lot of important developments that have produced positive change in some countries, but it has come with a really intense backlash everywhere. And that's something that I witnessed very much in my former country in the United States, where it has become a key issue for the Republican Party that has really focused on trans issues. And unfortunately, it's one that seems very prevalent in the UK, maybe even more so since arriving here, where this issue is really debated also in academic institutions, where trans people are somehow presented as their rights somehow defecting from other rights, which is, I think, logically quite a difficult argument to make, but one that I've been confronted with a few times since arriving.
This is definitely a conversation that we must continue, Philip. It's been fantastic to have you on the podcast, and we're delighted to have you as part of our department as well. So welcome to UCL, and we look forward to welcoming you onto the UCL Uncovering Politics podcast once again. We've been discussing Philip's book, When States Come Out, Europe's Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, and his recent article, Not That Niche, Making Room for the Study of LGBTIQ People in Political Science, published this year in the journal, European Journal of Politics and Gender. And we've also been talking about Philip's forthcoming book, which, Philip, I didn't actually ask you. When can we look forward to your next book?
That one should be out at the end of next year, and it's
Fantastic.
My co-authored book with Christina Stöckel.
And that's when hopefully we'll have you back onto the podcast. Next week, we'll be starting a new occasional series of more biographical episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. We'll be joined by Mark Steers, Professor in the UCL Department of Political Science and Director of the UCL Policy Lab, to discuss his remarkable life as a political theorist, speechwriter to Ed Miliband, think tank chief, and bridge between the worlds of academia and policymaking, and what is driving his work in the Policy Lab today. Remember, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Conor Kelly and Eleanor Kingwell-Benham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.